I am live streaming. I'm gonna just message you. Okay. Okay. Okay, it should be coming from like thefieryangel@gmail.com or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
Tell me if you got it. Great.
I can see myself even in the little.
Yeah, just 15 seconds.
That's fun.
So there'll be a bunch at the beginning. It's so nice that all four neuro people.
It is pretty, yeah.
That's pretty great.
Yeah, I'm not good to play.
No. Well, at least 3 of us got our PhD. We'll see.
Thanks. First, anyway. Yeah, well, who knows? I like being a first, and I like to be a trailblazer, you know?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, no, not on this one. Not this time.
How's it feel to be done?
Oh.
How about you feeling? Talking about 2 hours?
I have not yet submitted my dissertation online. I need to change a few things. I did some analyses that, like very minor analysis that like nicely addresses a few little issues. And yeah, just add a few lines. Honestly, I haven't been thinking about it. I've been thinking about getting an apartment that I have.
Did you have now?
What?
You have one now?
Did you move?
I haven't moved. I'm moving Sunday.
Nice.
Me too.
To Potrero.
Oh, nice.
I can see myself posting the link.
Where have you posted?
It's live streaming right now. Currently, we are online.
Hello.
We're all waving to our parents, the only people who are watching this.
Yeah, but in the future, it'll just be a YouTube link. So unless you edit it, this is all
Oh,
going to be
dang.
all the time.
Dang.
It could stay there.
I mean, we can edit it down beforehand or not. Who knows?
Show.
Yeah, I'll move here.
Okay, my hair.
Yeah, your hair. That's what you're going to be like. Man, I really enjoyed that Dr. Uncopies. That hair at the beginning. That was crazy. But yeah, so I'm not a friend. So the way my housing has gone is that
Wait, do you want to be on record saying this?
yeah, it's okay. It was kind of difficult to find an apartment. I was looking for rooms, and rooms are between like $1,500 and $2,000. And I didn't end up finding any place that I could go into that I wanted to that would allow 2 cats. And I realized that like if I have to get a studio, which is gonna be like 400 square feet or something, it'll be like 3,000 or more. So the cats alone will cost me between $12,000 and $18,000 next year. Having the cats, I'm not sure if they're worth that. Nonetheless, I'm probably going to keep them. I found a room though with these cool guys. It was like it worked out, and all they had to do was pass it by their landlord. And the landlord was like a little hesitant
Because of the cats.
because of the cats, and they got back to my potential housemates and said, actually, we're gonna sell the place, so you guys have to get out too. So not only did that room fall through for me, but it fell through for them.
Little guys.
Yeah, poor guys. So one of them
Good way to
took
start.
that situation and was like, okay, I'm gonna try and live alone. The other guy, I don't know who reached out for it, I can't remember, but we are now looking, or we're looking together. And we had a good kind of rapport the first, like during that first thing, much better than most other people. But now, you know, we've gone apartment hunting together, we found an apartment, we've signed it, a 3-bedroom between us. We're looking for a 3rd roommate, we're not planning on keeping this ourselves. Negotiated rent. He's taking the master bedroom and parking, and now we're looking through people. So we got through a lot of like stresses as a new kind of housemaid couple, seriously. And it's gone really well. It's like these are like really nice. He's also a cool guy. Like was here for a little bit. He left after 6 months to be part of this biotech company. He was like fifth.
Years and stuff.
Yeah,
Oh.
he was the 5th employee there, and was there until it was 250 people. Then he left, and now he's starting another biotech company. He salsa dances and likes Burning Man. He's like a cool guy. I like him. But now,
Walks on the beach.
what?
Long walks on the beach.
Absolutely, he's into spirituality and meditation, and he's German. And so now we're looking for another person, and this guy fell through yesterday because the price was it's a little expensive. Like even for San Francisco, it's like a little more expensive.
It won't be that difficult to find.
Sure, I'm just like I feel like we've gone through it. We've seen a bunch of, not much, but a decent number of people, and like ideally we want someone that we also get along with. Like this guy who fell through that I was excited about. He's an industrial designer, an artist in his own time. He like does crafting things. He does figure drawing. He's self-professed nerd, on board game nights and that kind of shit. I think he would have been a lot of fun.
Like you.
Yeah, I found
Basically.
there was,
Yeah.
and I'm not necessarily looking for, but I saw a lot of
Yeah.
similarities there, and I
Like,
would,
way.
yeah, he was saying like, oh, I figured out for him to say like, oh, I've also been doing figure drawing recently. I'm like, that is really similar. But yeah, what are these expressions?
Curiosity.
It's like, oh my god, we can go draw naked people together. How nice.
Yeah. That's a definite bonding experience.
Absolutely. It really is. It's very nice. But helpful. So tomorrow we'll.
I think there'll be more people.
Yeah. The lease starts today. So ideally, as soon as possible, I can stop paying for half of this place.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, that's the main stress of my life. But yeah, that the downside, the place is at it's do you know Potrero Hill? You know there's like 18th Street.
Yeah.
That's the shit that's happened. It's not right next to 18th Street, unfortunately. It's like 0.7 miles away from 18th Street. Like on the edge of Potrero Hill to the Mission. It's at the top of the hill. So it has beautiful views, and it's also at the top of the hill. So like biking I think will be not really feasible. At certain of these slopes are too much for me. So maybe I'll bike. Yeah. You're right. I can get. I have solved
I
this.
know the perfect hill for you to get stronger if you want.
I have solved this in another way.
Scooter.
Not scooter actually, because scooters do not. We can talk about this another day.
Okay.
I only lost one.
What?
My mom's not gonna make it.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, no pictures.
I think I can live with that. I think I can live with that.
I'm so glad I
Sure.
didn't know this. Huh?
You're live on there.
Yeah, it's
Is
live
your
right now.
family watching?
Yeah.
Mom?
Yeah.
Hi.
Except I told him not to
And
text
we've not
it.
touched it since.
Yeah, I've touched
No,
it.
not
I
to, like,
hopefully have
text me, but
uploaded Anna's. I don't know.
sweet.
No rush.
I'm hoping it's on there.
Thank you so much.
there's no AC.
Congratulations.
I'm going to, there is?
Thanks for
What?
doing it first.
No,
but
I don't feel cold.
I knew what to
It's
expect.
very strange. It's at least.
These are also our
years
cohort
later.
mates. This is Ian
It's your
and
spot.
Marcy. My sister.
Doesn't matter, I'm gonna be.
Hi.
Hi,
Nice to meet
hi,
you.
nice to meet you.
I'm gonna use my.
This is Patrick's
It's
aunt,
also, I
Sherry.
feel it in the other.
Huh, my aunt. Yes. I have. Yes.
Yeah, it's definitely.
The boss is coming.
It is really.
That's where we're going.
This is my spot.
Hello?
Yeah.
So I got shamed into doing some slides.
Oh my god.
No, really?
Oh, you were not a slide person.
I guess, yeah.
I didn't think I was a slide person.
You have an HDMI?
They're on my, can I just plug in?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can do
I
it.
need to see something. Do you want me to look?
No, it's fine.
You're coming right now. Oh, you are on vacation.
What? No, I'm not ready for this. I thought you would have been on slides.
Well, I'm gonna say the same thing I would have said, I just have a few slides to make people laugh.
That'll come in handy. Oh, you did, hi, you made it, thanks for coming on your vacation.
Of course.
So,
No, it's a holiday, yeah.
so after this, should we go
Yeah.
through?
Yeah.
I'll go with the version
Yeah, thanks to us.
It's gonna be blazing up
Yeah.
there. Isn't it? It's gonna be blazing.
So what have you been doing with your vacation?
Nothing so far.
Okay, you just started.
No, I'm
You look very.
I have
Okay.
so some friends are coming and we will go to Yosemite
Right now, so this will be like 97 by then.
and then they drive all the way to Las Vegas and Cameleon and I'll be joining them in Las Vegas.
Yeah, no, it's pretty brutal out there. Here's the paperwork.
Thursdays.
Not this.
So, yeah.
Just hold on to it and we're done.
Traveling.
You've done this trip.
No, I still have to finish up some runs and stuff like that. Because it's never ending.
Yeah, that's
So, are you taking some time off?
Oh, yeah, I just, got back from a 10-day road trip, and so this week, I'm moving,
Zana says,
and then next week, to San Francisco, trail.
Yeah.
And next Thursday I'm going to New York. I'll be there for a week. And then I'll go to Mexico for 2 weeks. By myself.
It's such a silly, like, it's like,
That's it. Ithaca.
Oh, you have to.
So I have a month. Traveling.
And then you start.
And then I have a week back. So in that week,
yeah, it's like,
my stresses right now are finding a third. I have one housemate, a 3-bedroom. And we have to find a third housemate. So that's the main stress. And that's pretty much it.
we had, this is the second one today. We had the
No, it's sounds.
and it was already
It's good.
Yeah, you're not gonna have a lot of time to, help with the housemate.
Yeah, well, thanks.
Oh, yeah, so we really were trying to get this stuff, he's also, my housemate is also leaving, for a while, so,
Hey.
we'd love to not, eat the cost of a third person for a month, but we kind of have to. And we've been, even though I was traveling, we've been like Skyping, with housemates, and he lives in San Francisco, so he's been showing people and doing a nice job.
Remember I complained about.
Yeah, and we're interviewing some people from.
There was really a nice
Hopefully we
change.
can.
Good luck. Yeah. I guess there are a lot of people.
Yeah, there are a lot of people. There are a lot of people that are a good fit, that also like want this confluence of location and cost and stuff. But yeah, it's fun. It's like, besides a little bit of stress about trying to get all set up.
I've never been a slide.
Exciting to think about.
Did you know these people in the house?
So the housemate, I met him because I was going to join his house. He and his roommate. So I was to join them. However, the landlord, while after considering me, was like, actually, I think I'm gonna sell the place. So you guys also want to leave. So not only did I not get it, but they had to leave too. So that sucks.
That's intense.
But fortuitously, one of the guys, we're now, we've had to play together. Seems like really great. We've done a good job, like, trying to replace We're a team. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna sit down.
You can have access.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll give it to Zainab. Right now it's actually live. I don't know if she posted it. Well, I'm going to give it to
It's been a few years. And how like after it's been a few years, it's like
like Sim City or but they're not the same.
All right, why don't we get started? Thanks for braving the heat today. And special welcome to Zainab's parents who are joining us via Skype. Welcome to Zainab's defense. I like metaphors, and so when I was thinking about what to say today, I was trying to figure out what the right metaphor was for sort of working with Zainab. And one that kind of resonated with me was one that you're familiar with. You've got a beach around here, which is a sleeper wave, right? So this is, you're at the beach, there's nothing going on. Suddenly a really big wave comes, just overpowers everything, right, that you weren't expecting. And so, so Zainab, I wasn't expecting to join my lab until her advisor left. She showed up in the lab in your second year. And you know, she had a really good background coming in, and so I knew she would be a good fit. She'd already been working in both in neuroeconomics and in kind of judgment and decision making, you know, with L.P. Weber and Eric Johnson previously, and then been working on similar sorts of stuff with Sam. And so when she joined the lab, I got her engaged in a project we were just starting that became this kind of behemoth, 2 dissertations worth of research. You'll hear about some of it today. And her role there was really to help sort of develop a battery of decision-making tasks. And I learned while we were doing that she probably knows more about intertemporal choice than almost everyone on Earth. And you know, a number of papers came out of this, some of them methodological, some of them experimental. So Zainab sort of bit off a particular part of the project that you'll hear about today, which was sort of looking at what happens when we retest, you know, have people do this really big battery of a bunch of decision-making tasks, then retest them some number of months later and look at how things change and measure the reliability of those tests. And we were meeting one day, and I knew she was analyzing the data, and she came in and she said, oh, I've done this literature review. I'm like, oh yeah, she knew what she was doing. she had gone into the literature and basically for 60 different measures found like all the published reliability measures and put them together into this astounding review. And it was so big that it was hard to even know how to show the data, right? This is the plot from the paper. And this ended up being published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And many of you will be familiar with the fact that it's really hard to publish methodological work, which is what this was, in a journal of this kind of caliber. And I think it really speaks to her abilities that we got the paper in there. So this was just one of the times when I was surprised. Another one was, and you'll hear about this also today, she was analyzing the existing data set on kind of development of reinforcement learning and sort of response to reward, and that we collected earlier. And we've been fitting reinforcement learning models and doing what everybody does, which is take a model and fit it to the data. And she shows up in my office one day, she's like, oh, I fit a bunch of different models to the data, and as you're gonna see today, look, they actually tell us interesting different stories that we can't pull apart. This is one of the slides that you'll see. And what was amazing is, like, I don't know if anybody ever thought to do this before. And I think it really does have the potential to kind of change how people think about doing this kind of work once this stuff sort of hits the streets. So, those of you who know Zainab know that she's fairly soft-spoken, but her actions certainly are not, right? She does these, I couldn't find any pictures of you doing like Tough Mudder or those extreme events, but doing things like riding 500 miles on a bicycle from here to LA. I know that this is probably how she felt at some points in her graduate career. Like her head was going to explode. For me, it has really been like riding one of these huge waves and super fun. So, Zainab, it's all yours.
If I stop shaking, that would be nuts. All right. So today, I'm very excited to tell you what I learned in the last 4 or 5 years about behavioral and neural markers of self-regulation. Self-regulation is our ability to modify our behavior in service of long-term goals. And this concept has been of interest to researchers for a long time now. It has been studied so frequently because it is thought to relate to these vast array of different behaviors, from healthy eating to smoking to saving for the future. The reason why it has been related to these things is because these behaviors can be thought as having some common attributes. So they all have future consequences that can suffer if long-term goals, if short-term goals are prioritized. These consequences involve some sort of uncertainty, and often we want to be better at these decisions, even if we know we're not doing great at it. So particularly because of this trade-off between long and short-term goals and how long-term goals can suffer if we prioritize the short-term ones, they have been studied with respect to this concept of self-regulatory abilities. The way we do this as psychologists is by coming up with cognitive tasks or surveys and extracting some sort of marker from these that we then relate to the behaviors we're trying to understand. But what do I mean by a marker? I keep using this term in the title. And now, so how can we understand what a marker is? That's from a cognitive task or a survey. Well, probably the best way to do this is to do an example together. So I'll show you an example from a cognitive task and a survey first to get us set up for the rest of the talk, because these will come up in both both of the studies that I will present today. So we'll first start with an example of a cognitive task. And I know it's really warm, but it is also after lunch, so I need to get your blood flow going. So I'm going to have to ask you to move your arms a bit. I'm going to present you words on the screen, and these words are going to be in different colors. If the word is printed, yes, it is very warm. If the word is printed in red, please raise your right hand. If the word is presented in blue, please raise your left hand. These words are going to be coming up quickly, so please try to do it as quickly as you can, but also try to respond correctly. All right. Okay, are you ready? Now that we have extra air, I'm hoping that you can answer that question. Yeah. Okay, so let's go. There's going to be 8 or 10 trials, we'll see. Okay, 1, 2, 3. So this is called this is a task that's been in the literature for a long time. It's called the Stroop task, and the effect is probably what you just experienced. That weird confusion in that last trial where the printed word did not match the color that was on the screen, and that strange feeling that you got where you were trying to withhold a response to execute another response. That is why we think this task has something to do with self-regulatory abilities. But more generally, this also demonstrates some properties that is more that applies to other kinds of cognitive tasks as well. So I'm going to keep using this throughout the talk as the example of a cognitive task and how we extract the marker from this. So one thing that's very common to tasks like this, so you had 2 options of actions that you could do, raising your right or left hand. And we also had different conditions in this task. So we had the congruent condition where the print color also matched the word on the screen, and the incongruent condition where the print color did not match the screen. Now, we can extract the 2 things I can measure when you are doing this task. The raw performance measures are the response times and accuracy. So how quickly you are responding and how accurately you are responding. And we can look at these things in both the congruent conditions or the incongruent conditions separately. That's one way of analyzing this data. So we can have condition variables, but additionally, and more interestingly, the more cognitively interesting thing about designing these tasks would come from looking at differences between these 2 conditions. So we would be looking at contrast measures with the idea that all the cognitive processes involved in responding in a congruent trial is the same as what you're doing in an incongruent trial, except for that one process, that self-regulatory ability that you must execute in that incongruent trial, that is the thing that we are trying to capture. So if we subtract these performance measures from one condition than the other, then hopefully we can distill that cognitive ability and use that as our marker that we can then relate to the behaviors we're trying to understand. Okay, so these 2 kinds of variables are going to come up later again. We can look at measures either in each condition in isolation, or we can build these contrast measures. Now these contrast measures are also important because these are the ones, because we believe they distill this cognitive process we're trying to understand, are the ones that we end up using in building mechanistic models. And that's a broader goal that we would like to achieve, but it's not clear whether these variables are good for this purpose. Okay, so that's one distinction between our variables, the different kinds of markers that we can have. But then there's also another distinction. So these 2 types of variables, response times and accuracies, these are raw measures that I can measure directly from performance. But they aren't always extremely easy to interpret. So if we have a participant, for example, who responds very quickly on this task but not very accurately, and another that responds very accurately but slowly, it's hard to tell who performs better in this task. So when we have raw measures and problems of interpretations like this, as cognitive psychologists, we have a good tool under our belts to help us resolve these kinds of problems, and that's to build computational models. And by building computational models, we try to understand the underlying, we try to come up with a way to describe the underlying cognitive processes that will yield us these raw measures we can extract from our data. The kind of models that are used for these kinds of tasks are called drift diffusion models, which are an example of sequential sampling models. And the idea in these models is that in each trial, a participant decides between one or the other action, and this decision to take one or the other action is a result of a sampling procedure, a sampling of evidence from the stimulus towards one or the other decision. So across a trial, across the period of a trial, a hypothetical decision variable is accumulated towards one or the other decision boundary, and when the amount of evidence you have reaches one of them, you execute a response. These models can have different kinds of parameters, but the two that will come up later in this talk that are thought to be potentially related to self-regulatory processes are first the drift rate, so the average speed with which you process the information and reach one boundary to execute a decision, to execute an action. And the second is the threshold, which is the distance between where you start and how and the boundary you reach to before you before you take the action, which would capture something like how much evidence you need, so how much attention you're paying to one action versus the other. Okay, so in addition to our raw variables, another distinction would be between our raw variables and our model variables, and we would use model variables more generally in trying to understand effects that would be difficult to interpret just looking at the raw measures. Okay, so now we have some sense of what the different kinds of markers can look like from cognitive variables using the Stroop task and the different distinctions, the condition and contrast measures, and the raw model variables. So let's look at an example from a survey. What would a survey marker look like? Well, surveys are self-report questionnaires where participants are presented with scenarios or characteristics to rate themselves on, or their likelihood to engage in that activity. Here, I'm presenting you 4 questions from one subscale of self-inhibition related questionnaire. So if we have a participant who, for example, rates themselves highly on all of these questions, the way we would go about, the one simple way, the most straightforward way to calculate, extract some sort of marker would be to sum these scores up and come up with a subscale score. We could also take the average, or there are other more advanced ways of analyzing this kind of data too, but the idea is you are presented with certain items, certain questionnaires, you rate yourself, and from that data we extract something for specific subscales. So the general framework of how we study self-regulatory markers and relate them to the behaviors we're trying to understand is by using either these cognitive tasks or surveys, and we've been doing this, like I mentioned, for a while as psychologists. So if we've been doing this for a while, and if we have all of these measures, then why are we still talking about it? Well, because I believe that self-regulation research suffers from prioritizing mechanistic models too much and not paying enough attention to measurement rigor and the suitability of those measurements, of those variables that we extract from these different modalities for the research question that we are interested in. Now let me unpack that. What do I mean by the research question we are interested in? What could be a rigorous way to go about measurement? So the 2 types of research questions I'm going to talk about today, the first one is individual difference questions. So in individual difference questions, an example of this could be, for example, we just all experienced the Stroop effect, how much slower you are in responding in an incongruent condition compared to a congruent condition, whether that relates to, for example, how much you save for your retirement. A question like that is an individual difference question where we're trying to understand the variability in the real world behavior, saving behavior, using the variability in the experimental measurement. we're treating the whole, the sample as a whole and checking whether the relationship holds for the whole group, whole sample. Additionally, another type of research question would be group difference questions, where we can have, in addition to the experimental variable that we can measure, an additional independent variable, an additional independent grouping variable. And in these kinds of studies, we would be checking whether the relationship holds for each of, or whether the relationship differs for each of these groups separately. Crucially, the statistical properties required for these kinds of different research questions are not the same for all kinds of variables that we can extract. And that's what I focused on for the last 4 years in trying to understand by taking a step back from building mechanistic models and looking at a large variety of different kinds of measures and how appropriate they are for the question that we are trying to study, for the analysis that we must run. And I will present you examples of both kinds of these research questions. And I hope to convince you that a lack of attention to these properties can hamstring our cumulative understanding and hold our theoretical advancements back as well. Okay, so let's jump into the data. First, we'll start with individual difference measures. We're in this study, in this example, we're going to be looking for variables that do a good job in capturing something like a trait about people. So if we believe that the dependent variable that we extract from a cognitive task or a survey is capturing something about a person, we would hope that if it's a good individual difference measure, it would do a good job in separating people out in the sample. So whatever it says about that person is different than what it says for other people. Only then we would have a good sense of the differences in this sample. Secondly, we would want a good individual difference measure to say the same thing about that person whenever we measure it. So we would hope that if we have 2 time points, time point 1 and time point 2, the person would fall in somewhere similar on that dependent variable scale, regardless of when the measurement takes place. Now, if we have this kind of data, multiple time points of the same variable, this allows us to think about the sources of variance in a very systematic way and summarize these intuitions we have about good individual difference measures in a single metric of reliability. So with this type of data, we can have the change from each time point for each subject between within subjects, for all of the subjects, the within subjects variance, and between all the subjects for each time point, so the between subjects variance. So what we are looking for is a measure that has small within subjects variance and high between subjects variance to do a good job in telling people apart and always saying the same thing about that person. We can quantify this. So reliability gives us a way to quantify this. So this number is what we use as our proxy to quantify the suitability of a variable for individual difference analysis. So with this framework in mind, we created the largest battery we could think of the various kinds of self-regulation measures, and ended up with this 10-hour-long battery of 35 tasks, 24 surveys. And we tried to keep our sample large too, and asked 150 people to complete this battery twice, 2 to 4 months apart from each other. So how did our measures perform? How did our variables turn out? Well, the main thing that we compared was these 2 measurement modalities, the surveys and tasks. And what we found was that variables from task measures were systematically less reliable compared to variables from survey measures. That means that variables from task measures were systematically less suitable for individual difference analyses compared to variables from survey measures. So it was important to find this difference at a large scale, but it was also important to establish that this was not just a fluke with our data set, but was also the case in the literature as well. So as was mentioned, we completed the largest literature review we could think of on this and pulled out at a variable level, not just task or survey level, the reliabilities of all of these things from the literature, and found for surveys, for variables from surveys, our results mirrored the literature relatively closely. But for the tasks, the reliabilities in the literature were higher because, well, I can only speculate on the reasons for this. It could be indicating a potential publication bias, because who really would want to publish tasks that's suggesting that tasks are not reliable, especially if you're going to go on and build a model using those measures. But this was one difference that we found between our data and the literature. That said, we did do additional analyses to confirm that the literature was similarly noisy as our data as well, but I won't go into the details of that now. So, because we had, before presenting you these results, I talked about what might be driving reliability, the different sources of variance. Because we had the raw data, we had the ability to look at which of these sources of variance might be the culprit for this difference in reliability. And it turned out that it was both, not just one or the other, but summaries had both higher between subjects variability, higher between subjects variance, so they did a better job in telling people apart from each other, but also lower within subjects variance, so people rated themselves similarly whenever they were asked those questions. Okay, so these were the first findings, and it was important to establish this discrepancy between the kinds of measurement modalities, self-regulation measurement modalities. But when we were doing our literature, it also became clear that it confirmed our intuition that these psychometric properties of cognitive task measures are not studied as extensively as they are for the survey measures. So, having this large data set, we decided to look at our task measures, their reliability a little more closely. So if you remember, we have both our raw measures and our model-based measures. For our model-based measures that are more appropriate, that help us with cognitive interpretations. And we had both condition measures and contrast measures for both of these types of measures. So looking at the reliability of our condition measures for both our raw and model-based variables, we found both good news and bad news. The good news was that our model-based variables were similar in their reliability to our raw measures. So researchers who want to use these model-based variables because of their suitability, because of their ease of interpretation, were justified in doing so compared to raw measures. But none of these measures, neither raw nor model-based, really reached any level of acceptable reliability, which in the literature is often talked about as 0.75. And here we can see we don't really exceed, these measures don't really exceed 0.5. So that was worrying. That was one bad thing. Things got worse when we looked at contrast measures. So it is a mathematical truth that the contrast measures were going to have lower reliabilities because there is a subtraction involved which increases the variance. The problem though was that wasn't just that these measures were less reliable, they were basically not reliable at all. And worse yet, these are the measures that we believe give us the cognitive process we are interested in understanding. And then we take these and build the mechanistic models to hopefully inform interventions. But these variables are not suitable for this kind of analysis. And that was important to establish at this large of a scale to point to a potential reason on why we might not have been made as much progress as we want. Okay, so what did we learn from looking at individual difference markers of self-regulation? Well, we learned that variables from the two different variables, from cognitive tasks and surveys, are differentially appropriate for individual difference analyses. We found that cognitive task measures did not give us variables that we would want to use for these kinds of analyses. And this was particularly alarming for the contrast measures because those are the variables that we would want to use in mechanistic models. Now, this isn't all bad news. This doesn't mean we should give up on cognitive tasks. It is still what makes our field fun. But, and we also find, for example, the Stroop effect that we all experience. That also always happens in our sample too, whenever we measure it. The problem is, the individual difference in how much slower you get, that's not stable across time. So this doesn't mean that we should give up on using the Stroop task to study anything. Perhaps it would be more appropriate for studying something like a group difference. But for individual difference questions, using these single differences of response time is just not a good enough proxy for a trait-like variable. Okay. So, if these task measures aren't good for individual difference analyses, then let's look at group difference analysis to see if task measures perform better there, if we can get more leverage on the question using task in that context. In this second study, we looked at both behavioral and neural measures, and this time, instead of individual difference analyses, we were interested. So one thing that is interesting to understand in self-regulation research is change in self-regulatory behavior. So especially because these are behaviors that can be problematic for people, and people might want behavior change, it's important to understand how we can change or manipulate self-regulatory abilities. There are different ways of studying this question of change of self-regulatory abilities. You can look at pre-post designs, you can look at clinical versus non-clinical groups. We decided to look at it from a developmental perspective. And we asked whether self-regulatory abilities differed between these three age groups of kids, teens, and adults. Now this is interesting to think about, to look into, because there's this public health finding that or teenagers, adolescents, are more likely to engage in reckless, risky behavior. They are just not as well equipped to use self-regulatory abilities in real-world situations and get themselves in trouble. So that's one motivator behind analyzing this question of change from a developmental perspective. But when we think about these risky situations, they also have an interesting property to themselves. So now the question of self-regulation, we think of it with respect to these risky behaviors, risky situations, like drunk driving, for example. But these kinds of situations have this strange property that not all situations have, and that is often they deliver a small, frequent reward, like the thrill of driving drunk, if that's your thing. But it can also end up in a catastrophic failure, like an accident. So this difference in the different kinds of outcomes and their frequencies and how these three age groups process these varying attributes in risky situations was what we were trying to get at. And to do this, we created our own task that we called Machine Game, where we could manipulate these two attributes of sizes of rewards and their frequency across different conditions and see how groups differ in this task. And this task is related to self-regulatory abilities because to perform well on it, you need to pay attention not to just the immediate outcome that you are experiencing, but to pay attention to the whole history of outcomes you have experienced in each situation to perform optimally. So in each, we had 4 conditions, and in each condition, participants were asked to either play a machine or not play a machine. So like a slot machine, you either play it or don't play it. But all of these machines were represented by fractals, and they varied on 2 attributes, frequency and expected value. So we had 2 good machines. These 2 good machines had a positive expected value overall, which meant that if you kept playing them, in the long run, you would make more points than you would lose. And then we had 2 bad machines that if you kept playing those machines, even though you got positive outcomes sometimes, in the long run you would lose more points, depending on the size of the outcomes. And then the other attribute we manipulated was the frequency. So we had 2 low variance machines that delivered the 2 outcomes with equal probability. And then we had high variance machines that delivered a small reward, in this case, a small reward very frequently, but a catastrophic loss very infrequently. And then another positive expected value equivalent of that, where you experience a small loss, but also a large gain infrequently. So the optimal behavior, if you are learning, if you are regulating your behavior in a manner that indicates you are understanding these reward contingencies, you would eventually start playing these machines all the time, even though you are experiencing losses most of the time. And you would learn not to play these two machines because you are learning that even though you're experiencing losses most of the time, when you gains most of the time, when you experience a loss, it's much, much worse than you would want. So the timeline of the task looks something like this, where you were presented with a fractal that represented the condition for up to 5 seconds. You had 5 seconds to respond. You either decide to play or pass. If you played, you got a certain number of points depending on the condition. If you decide to pass, you saw a screen that said pass. And if you timed out, you would see a screen that said too slow. That would hopefully prompt you to respond faster. Okay. So, how did the behavior look like in this task? Well, so I'm going to present the 4 conditions again as they were. And on top, we're going to see the bars that represents the playing behavior in each machine. So here, on the y-axis is the frequency of playing in each condition, as opposed to passing that machine. The colors represent the 3 different age groups. And for this good machine, we find that most of the time, all groups played that machine. So they understood it was a good machine. They kept playing it. The kids were less likely to keep playing that machine compared to adults and teens, though that difference was not statistically significant. What was statistically significant was the behavior, the difference between the groups in these bad machines. So kids, even though they experienced losses, they just kept playing those bad machines. It was as if they didn't care, or the losses didn't matter to them. And because of their behavior in these tasks, they performed worse. They lost more points compared to the adults and the teens. So the behavioral group difference that we're going to be trying to understand, the behavioral group difference that we're going to try to map onto certain cognitive processes is going to be specifically the behavior in these bad machines. But when we look at the distribution of performance within each of these age groups, we find a pattern that is found in the literature relatively frequently, and that is these groups aren't really homogeneous. Just because a participant is in the happens to be younger, it doesn't necessarily mean they are not going to perform well. So these groups are relatively there are large individual differences within each group, and this would hamstring us in our statistical analyses when we're looking for group differences. So instead of this, instead of this arbitrary demographic grouping, we decided to group our participants by their performance, specifically by their performance on these bad machines. So a participant would be defined as a learner if they became less likely to play these machines throughout the task, and a non-learner if they kept playing these machines. And this gave us 2 groups of learners and non-learners that I'm going to focus for the rest of the analyses that were more homogeneous, and so we can pull these groups apart better. Okay. So in this task, again, the variables that we can measure directly are response times and their playing behavior, right? But even their playing behavior doesn't imply the same cognitive process for each of these conditions. So playing the good machines indicates learning and understanding of the contingencies, whereas playing the bad machines suggests that they're not learning. So similar to the stream task and the response times and accuracies there, it would be helpful if we could use a computational framework to identify, to look at potential cognitive processes that might underlie this behavioral group difference. The framework we choose for this task is not the drift diffusion models, but the reinforcement learning models, because these models are able to capture change across time, change in beliefs across time, and that's what we're trying to understand. Whether kids, teens, or adults, or for the rest of this, the learners and non-learners, update their beliefs about each of these conditions in a similar manner. So for our task, this would look something like this. The first time you are presented with a fractal, the first time you see a machine, you don't know anything about it. Your expected value for it is 0. It could give you a good outcome, it could give you a bad outcome, you just don't know. So you just make a random choice, and say you decide to play the machine and got a good outcome. Now you're happy, yay. But this also means that what you expected did not match what you just experienced. So in any situation where your expectation does not match what does not match your observation, you can generate this thing called the reward prediction error, difference between what you expect and you observe, that you can now use to update your beliefs about this machine. So in our case, if we're going to go with numbers, the reward prediction error would be 10 because the reward you experience is 10 points, your expected value was 0. Now, having this reward prediction error, you want to update your behavior, but do you really want to update it completely? Do you want to really believe that it's always going to give you 10 points, or do you want to maybe like tune that a little down so that the speed with which you update your belief is regulated, is controlled, governed by this parameter, this parameter called learning rate, alpha. And this is the first cognitive process that this framework can give us. So in this case, if we keep going in this example, if we have a learning rate of 0.2, now we believe a reward prediction error of 10, we can use these two pieces of the model to update our expected value to be 2. So the next time, after a few trials, you've seen this machine again, now your expected value is not 0, but 2. Which means, so now you can translate this belief about this machine into an action. And how much your decision relies on this expected value versus how much you want to ignore what you've just learned about it and just choose randomly is governed by another parameter, this parameter called beta. So in the context of this talk, the alpha will be referring to the learning rate, and I'll be talking about beta as expected value dependence of your decision. So how much your decision relies on the expected value that's been updated from the previous trials. So in this case, if you have a positive expected value and you have a high beta, so your decision is going to rely on this expected value, you would be more likely to play that machine and maybe get yet another positive reward. And this process would keep going on throughout the task until your beliefs match. Learning would only stop if your beliefs match the real continuity of the machine. But this model also gives us, so in its barest form, like this, it can capture these two processes of how fast you update your beliefs and how much your decisions rely on those beliefs. But it is flexible enough to incorporate other intuitions as well. So, if you believe, for example, you learn differently from positive and negative outcomes, then you can build this intuition into the model with two different learning rates. So you would update your belief using one learning rate when you experience a positive outcome, and another learning rate when you experience a negative outcome. Okay, so we have this framework, and we have this framework to understand behavioral group difference, but this, we would hope, we now also need a way to evaluate this model with respect to the behavior it's trying to describe. And this will be a slight tangent, but in general, when you have any kind of data, if you're trying to describe it with a model, what you can do is this thing called cross-validation. So you can split your data in at least two of a test and training set, and then fit your model into the one subsample of your data, subset of your data, and get your parameter estimates. So in this case, your best guess as to those parameter estimates, your best guess on that model is represented by that dashed orange line. But since the utility of a model comes from not just describing your own data, your own little sample, but from predicting new data, now you would want to evaluate this with respect to data that you have left out. And as a more meta point, this is why we would want good models of self-regulation too. So we wouldn't have to measure everything all the time and model it in its little pocket, but have more generalizable models that we can predict behaviors without having to measure everything. So, but back to our simple example, once you have your parameter estimate, you can use that now to predict left out data. And in this case, your left out data, these blue dots look something like this. So your model will guess them to be on this orange line, which now gives you a way to evaluate the correspondence between the actual data and your model. And yields this metric of prediction accuracy that helps you evaluate how descriptive your model is of your data that you are fitting it to. This is the framework, this prediction accuracy metric, is what we're going to use to compare our models as well. So our modeling framework is the reinforcement learning model. So we'll start with comparing the two simplest models from this framework, just with these two parameters, and then another model with two learning rates for positive and negative outcomes. When we do that, on the x-axis here, we have the two models. So the model with just one learning rate and beta, the expected value dependence, and on the y-axis, the prediction accuracy. We find that the model with two learning rates performs better compared to the one with only compared to the model with only a single learning rate. And that's an interesting finding, but it would be it's more important for us to establish that this model is equally descriptive of both groups in our data. So when we split this prediction accuracy by the groups that we are trying to understand the behavioral difference between, we find that the models are descriptive of one group and less so of the other. Now that's problematic because we want to use these models to understand the difference, the cognitive process that differs in this one task. But with a result like this, we can only say that the non-learners are doing something that we can't capture with our model. So any difference we find in the parameters could be difficult to interpret. Still, let's look at what these models suggest with respect to where the cognitive difference lies. Well, they suggest something somewhat counterintuitive and odd. So each column again is each of these models, and the rows are the parameters. So the first three rows are our learning rates, and now the models are telling us that the non-learners are learning faster than the learners, but they're not really using this, they're choosing randomly, whereas even though the learners are learning slower, they make their decisions based on their expected values. And that's just strange, which is fine. This could be the truth about our data set, but it also makes us wonder whether there's another way to capture what might be going on. And thankfully, computational models do have this flexibility to incorporate other intuitions. So if we go back to our framework, we were assuming that this updating process of using the learning rate and the reward prediction error was a linear update. But that doesn't have to be the case. It could also be the case that this updating procedure, during this updating procedure, the expected values are somehow distorted. So an outcome just doesn't feel as good or as bad as it truly is. And this idea has a lot of backing in the behavioral economics literature, so it's not like we came up with this idea. But the implication of this would be, if you have a value distortion parameter of 1, which was what we were assuming before, there would be a linear updating of your value. But if it's less than 1, then, for example, a big loss would just not feel as big of a loss. This value distortion parameter can also lead to different behavioral patterns between the groups. And similar to the learning rates, these can differ between positive and negative outcomes as well. So what does it look like if we extend our behavioral models to include a value distortion parameter, a gamma parameter like this? Well, so this was what we had before. When we extend our models to have just a single value distortion parameter, just a single gamma, we don't necessarily find a major improvement compared to our simpler models. And again, evaluating these on prediction accuracy, on cross-validated prediction accuracy. What does become clear though, is that now our models are sensitive enough to capture this difference between the good and bad machines in some sense. So if a model does not distinguish in any of its parameters between gains and losses, then it always does a systematically worse job compared to another model that does have that distinction in its parameters. And that does kind of make sense when we think about the behavior too. We did not find a significant difference for the good machines, but we did for the bad machines. So this distinction between expected values seems to come through in our models as well. what happens if we add two separate value distortion parameters depending on the valence? Well, we again don't really find major improvements in how descriptive these models are of our data, which leaves us in a confusing position. We can't really we can't really tell which of these models is really a better explanation of our data. And worse yet, all of these models fit better for the learners compared to the non-learners. So we are in this odd situation where we just can't do a good job in explaining what the learners are doing using these models. Even more confusingly, and this is what Russ alluded to as well, when we look at the cognitive interpretations of where these models suggest the difference lie, these initial simpler models suggested, I call them the alpha models now, suggested the differences lay in the learning rates and how much your decision depended on the expected value. But now, these gamma models, as I call them, suggest that the difference in learning rates and how randomly you are responding, those are all attenuated, and the difference really lies in how much you distort the value. So according to these models, the cognitive difference lies in the fact that non-learners distort the value much more, and so a big loss doesn't feel as bad, and therefore keep playing about the sheep. So we have four models that we can't tell apart from each other, and two different cognitive stories. So we have these alpha models and the gamma models. So what did we learn about the behavioral group difference markers? Well, we found that these models are not distinguishable by the prediction accuracy, so we don't know which of these actually does a good job of describing behavior. And they fit one group better than the other, and suggest different cognitive accounts. If that's in this weird situation, what do we do? Well, one thing I didn't mention before is that this isn't the only data we have from these subjects. These subjects completed this task in the scanner, so we also have some neural data. So we turn to our neural data and ask two questions. We asked whether we can use this neural data to help us select our behavioral model, and we also asked whether this difference in how descriptive the behavioral models are also comes through in our neural analyses of the neural data. So first, we looked at one region where we believe these models should correspond, should predict regressors that correspond to the activity in a specific area, in the striatal area. So we looked at reward prediction errors generated by each of these models and how they correlated with the activity in these striatal regions that we would expect to have a relationship with from the literature, and found that one of the alpha models, the simpler models that explain the group difference using the learning rates, didn't really have anything to do with neural data, compared to the gamma models that explain the difference in the value distortion seem to have a bit more to do with the neural data. So this might help us rule out one behavioral model over the other. But the more crucial question is whether this difference in how descriptive the models are also comes through in our neural analyses. And so first we looked at what are the differences between the learners and non-learners, and we found some differences, some increased activity for learners in areas that are, in regions that are associated positively with the magnitude of a reward, which wasn't surprising and somewhat made sense. But if we have these analyses depend on regressors that are generated by differently suitable models. So we know that for the learners, these models are better descriptive of behavior. And if we look at the neural parameter estimates now in various regions related to value processing, we always find that the parameter estimates are much more variable for non-learners compared to the learners. So the relationship between the neural data, the brain, and the behavior predicted by the model is much more consistent for the learners compared to the non-learners, which are much more variable, most likely because these behavioral models are not really describing what the non-learners are doing in this case. Okay, so that was lots of words. What did we learn from looking at group difference questions in self-regulation markers, we found that model comparisons can reveal conflicting narratives for the behavioral group differences if we keep looking at them closely. We can use neural data to help resolve these questions. It is a relatively exploratory approach, so I wouldn't hang my hat on it just yet, but it is important to note that we can use these different sources of information to understand the behavior more fully. But we can, if we don't have good behavioral models of what's going on in the task, then these might also mask the neural differences that we are trying to understand between the groups. Okay, so with that, what did I tell you? Well, I tried to present examples of both individual difference analysis and group difference analysis questions of self-regulation. I showed you that one measurement modality does a better job, is much more suited for individual difference analyses than the other for when comparing cognitive tasks and surveys. And then in the group differences, I showed you that variables can lead to conflicting, confusing, and sometimes mass differences if not looked at extensively. I hope I've convinced you that it's important to examine these psychometric properties, statistical properties of these variables before we build mechanistic models. But this isn't to say that we should give up on mechanistic models. Those are still probably our bread and butter. We still want to build those, but hopefully a shift in perspective towards more rigorous measurement can help us build more unified models of self-regulation and help us with theoretical advancements as well. That's all I have for you today in terms of science. I do have more, but before that, I'll take questions.
This question probably comes from an ignorance of like the self-regulation literature. I was just wondering, like, to what extent is self-regulation a trait versus a state? And the motivation for this question is that in your first study you talked about it's alarming to use these tasks as to build mechanistic models because of the low test-retest reliability.
Right.
But if self-regulation was more of a state type thing, it's like it's not so much about whether I'm a good self-regulator versus bad self-regulator,
Yeah.
but when I'm a good self-regulator versus a bad self-regulator. The task might actually be capturing the state differences, and in that sense, it could actually be a better measure, a better way to build mechanistic models. I'm just wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah, absolutely thought about it, and not just me. People have been thinking about this for at least 50 years, if not longer. And Anthony has definitely asked me about this several times in the context of this work too. And you're right, that there are different ways of thinking about self-regulation, whether it is a trait or a state. It's probably a question that I can't answer conclusively. It's probably both, just like many things in psychology, in human behavior. But it's if cognitive tasks might again be good measures to build mechanistic models of state-like properties of self-regulation. I can't argue with that. But that's not what we have been doing. We've been treating them as good models of trait-like behavior and then building models with that. Again, I'm not saying that cognitive tasks are useless. What you're bringing up might well be the case, but that's something that we need to be more aware of. That's the point of this systematic way of separating all of these variables. But yeah, if we, in the long run, end up with a trait-like variable, model of self-regulation of its trait-like properties and state-like properties, I'd be perfectly happy with that. But right now, the way we lump all of these is just not helpful in the way. Yeah.
Really interesting talk. I'm curious about this, what makes a group when you're thinking about group differences. So you started with these different ages and then switched to learners versus non-learners and kind of then found a lot of, found certain models fitting the learners better than the non-learners. I'm curious how you think about that. Do you think about that in the sense that potentially the non-learners are not learning for different reasons and the learners are learning for the same reasons? Or do you think also if you looked at learners and not learners within each of your different age groups, and you would see differences. But I was just wondering if you could talk a bit more about how you think about what groups are and what are good groups to look at.
Right. Well, I mean, I think these are very much dependent on the question that you're interested in understanding. We did, set out to understand the difference between the age groups to begin with, but when we found these, when you collect data, even if you have this initial hypothesis of looking for the age group differences, if your groups aren't suitable for that kind of analysis, that's just going to lead you down a path where you're just not going to find the differences you're interested in. If the difference you're interested in understanding is one on performance, then grouping your participants based on that performance seem to make more sense and give us more leverage in understanding what's going on in this data set. So that's how I've been thinking about groups with respect to this. But that doesn't mean, so in other, well, I also did model comparisons for age groups, but that was contaminated with the learner and non-learner difference because the adult group had more learners, so it did fit better for them, so it was unclear whether it fit better for them because they were adults or because they were learners. But that's not to say that I would still stand by the fact that these demographic groups of kids, teens, and young adults, those were relatively arbitrary, but that doesn't mean that those can't be interesting groups for other questions. Just in this case, they weren't suitable for understanding the performance difference that we were trying to get a hold of. Oh yeah.
So I found the difference in reliability between the tasks and surveys really striking, in particular because you showed that the surveys are not just more reliable, but they're all more reliable.
Yeah.
Whereas among the tasks, there's a lot more variability. And as somebody who studies tasks and not surveys, I was wondering if you could say a little more about what is it among those tasks, do you think, or is there something about the tasks that predicts where they're going to fall on that? Something for people who build tasks to think about, like, what could we do maybe that makes more reliable tasks or less reliable tasks?
That's a great question, and I've looked at several attributes and I'm hoping to look at more of these things. But so there are, as cognitive task designers, we can control certain things like number of trials, duration of stimuli, but also with respect to the measures we can extract from these, with respect to the variables we can extract from these, the raw measures or the model parameters, different things we can do without model parameters, without fitting procedures. I have not found many things that would really generalize across all of them. There are some, so for example, one thing I looked at was number of trials for these different kinds of cognitive tasks, for at least 14 of them, and the effect of that on the reliability of the measure wasn't something that was consistent within a task. So within a task, there were different measures that either improved with more trials, or others that just stayed consistently unreliable. So it was, overall, I couldn't find a single pattern that would fit all of them. But what it did suggest to me was that, at least in task development, we can play with all of these variables and look at it more carefully before we move on. In your case, you have many more trials and use models that are tuned for those kinds of paradigms, and your liabilities might be different in our framework. In fact, when I looked at it, other types of models and compared them to each other, at least with the number of trials that we had, I didn't see major improvements. But that doesn't rule out the possibility that we can be better at it. It just means that with this limited set, where we were trying to cram everything into 10 hours, these measures weren't going to give us the kinds of things that we wanted. All right, now to the crying part. Okay, I'm not sure if I can cry. I think Anna squeezed out all the tears out of me this morning. But we'll see. I might. I'm not sure. It's really warm. Okay, first I have to start with this. Yes, exactly. We're all worshiping him here. That's what we do in our free time. We just put pictures of him. No, we don't do that. We did do it once. But as Russ mentioned, I had a bit of a rocky start to grad school and joined his lab my second year. And since I joined his lab, he's definitely been very supportive and mentored me in ways that I didn't even realize I needed to be mentored in. And I, oh God, damn it. Even though it took me some time to understand just how important it was everything that I was learning from him, he just never gave up on me, even though it took me a while to figure out what I was doing. That slow wave metaphor, sleeping wave metaphor is very appropriate. I mean, in the end, I might have had a big wave, but for the longest time, I was pretty dormant. But despite that, he stuck with me, and whether it was last-minute revisions or weekend imaging question answers, I got everything I needed and more. And the amount of respect I have for him is hard to describe. But just how he approaches questions, how thoughtful he is, and his incredible productivity is something that has really made it, has given me purpose in at least trying to achieve. So thank you. Okay, the rest of my committee. Ryan, if it weren't for your early work in ergonomics, I probably would have been in this field right now. It was just so exciting and mind-blowing to me that I couldn't think of anything better to do with my life. And here we are. So thank you. But thank you also for giving me a much better understanding of the field when I was teaching with you, to really grounding me in ergonomics and giving me a better sense of where I can make contributions. That will hopefully be coming up in my next position as well. Anthony, I have both taught with you and learned from you in your seminars, and you might remember I was always very astonished by just how you mapped on complex cognitive processes onto these neural mechanisms, just how you had this really clear model in your head, and I still don't have that, but I strive for it. And I hope I can improve on that, and you'll become a model for all of it. And Justin, I also taught and learned from you. And I probably learned one of the most fundamental skills I needed as a scientist from you, which is of reading papers. I really didn't know how to read scientific papers before you, and I didn't even know that was the case until I took your class. And also, which you might have noticed throughout this talk too, the way we build intuitions and communicate computational models really came through learning from you and designing the sections for your Harvard neuroscience class. So thank you, all of you, for all of this. I'm also really lucky to have earlier mentors. So my journey started at Penn, where I was in Joe Cable's lab, and his lab was just an amazing place to be in, and it was so much fun that I just couldn't stop doing research after. And my academic parents, Eric and Elke at Columbia, they just nourished me in ways that I didn't even expect them to, and I wouldn't be here without all of those that these people have done for me. Okay, now on to my lab. I need to thank my whole lab, but especially these two. Their insightful questions, brilliant comments, they really pushed me intellectually. I had to work pretty hard to keep up, but I only got better because of it. So I thank both Patrick and Ian for just making me a better scientist in general. I didn't even realize one could think about cognition the way you guys do, and I just hope I can use that in the future too. I also need to thank Chris and Oscar. Without their tireless work on open science tools, I literally would not be able to complete most of this work. And also their patience with me with all of my questions. I've asked many questions. Okay, so these were all the people who helped me with the work. And the rest of the people also helped me with the work, but they also kept me human. First, Arctic is on. Okay, so when I came here, I was feeling pretty lonely, and I definitely did not think of finding another family. But every time I felt alone, Anna and Patrick, they were there for me, whether it was just vacations to foreign lands, or Sunday potlucks, or joint birthdays, because yes, we are also born almost the same day. I just, grad school would have been absolutely impossible without you. And there's no one else I'd rather be confused with. I have many other friends to thank too. My sisters, as I call them, both from college and high school. I can't name all of them. They know themselves. If they see themselves here, all the better. But all of these people kept checking in with me when I could have easily slipped through cracks, especially during that literature review. God, that was boring. But yeah, so I need to thank each of these people, each of my sisters. And as Russ alluded to, there are more pictures of me cycling. And these people have really showed me both the beauties of California over the last year, and helped me stay sane by pushing me physically more than I was pushing myself mentally. So I thank all my new cycling friends, who I went on for a week for 545 miles in a camping every night. That was fun. And finally, my family, my friends who are probably still watching. If they're not asleep, they might be asleep. My mom and my dad. I came to the States almost to the date 11 years ago, and it was very unlikely that I would even get into a good school because I didn't go to a school where English was the language of education. But my parents never really allowed any circumstances to obstruct my hope for a better future. They gave me everything they could and more, and here I am, and I hold on to a principle I learned from each of them every day. From my mom, I learned resilience. So even a boring literature review can't break me. And from my dad, I learned moderation. So now I just cycle a lot when I work hard. That's all I have for today. Thank you all for your attention.